evening. I'm Teresa Skupik, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, April 9th. We begin tonight with U.S. President Donald Trump's latest wave of tariffs that have come into force. Imports from China were hit by a 104% rate amid an escalating standoff between the two world's biggest economies. Mr. Trump acknowledged the 104% rate for China sounds ridiculous, but insisted that Beijing wanted to make a deal to avoid it. But this afternoon, the president posted that China has shown a lack of respect and announced he's increasing tariffs on Chinese imports to 125%, effective immediately. China has again vowed to fight to the end in an escalated trade war with the U.S. as it announced it would raise tariffs on American goods to 84% this morning. Beijing also added an array of countermeasures. The Ministry of Commerce said that, quote, if the U.S. insists on further escalating its economic and trade restrictions, China has the firm will and abundant means to take necessary countermeasures and fight to the end. Dr. Moshe Lander, an economist and professor at Concordia University, joined us to discuss how reliant both China and the U.S. are on each other.
Reliant on each other. It's such a shame that they're trading these barbs with each other, but they both need each other. The Americans import a huge amount from China, but they also export a huge amount. Now, it's true, the Americans import about $300 billion more than they export, but there's another side to the ledger that's often not seen, which is that Asia, or China in particular, is financing America's huge trade deficit by buying their government debt. So if the Americans can't balance their budget, if they need to have this huge debt, China's the one that's financing a lot of it. And that's the part that's very little investigated. If the Americans could save more, if their government could be more responsible, they didn't need to borrow as much money, then that would be reduced, and that would actually give them more space then to reduce their trade deficit with China. So we keep focusing on this goods part of the story, but we're missing the asset part of the story, and that's a big part of it.
Dr. Lander also touched on the impact these back and forth tariffs are having on the market and that a global market meltdown has already been sparked.
Most markets are down at least 10%, which is technically called a correction. A few markets are down more than 20%, which is called a bear market. And I don't think that we're done yet. We're going to see over the next few days that the markets might stabilize a little bit. They might even show small gains. That should not be construed as the markets now support Trump's policy. It's just they're a little tired from hammering the sell button, and they need to give their wrists time to recover. If you think about going up a mountain, it's never smooth. And when you think you've reached the peak, you quickly find that, no, there's another peak behind that you haven't reached. It's the same thing coming down then, that just when you think you've reached the valley and that's the end of it, there's another hill on the other side of that valley that you have to come over before you can get to the next descent. And so I think that's what we have right now in financial markets, is that we're in this valley right now, but that should not be construed as we've reached the trough. It's that there's another little hill that we have to cross, and then we're going to find that there's a big chasm on the other side waiting for us.
Stock markets in Canada and the U.S. soared after Donald Trump posted on social media this afternoon that he's pausing some tariffs, except for China, which will face higher rates. In the post, Mr. Trump announced both a pause and a lower 10% reciprocal tariff. The S&P TSX Composite Index was up 864.2 points after the announcement. In New York, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 2,106.4 points. And to make things more interesting, the EU joined in on the retaliation. European Union member states have voted to approve retaliatory tariffs on $23 billion in goods. The 27-nation bloc, which called the U.S. tariffs unjustified and damaging, is planning a raft of tariffs, mostly in the 25% range, on a variety of U.S. imports, including motorcycles, poultry, clothing, and some types of food products. These countermeasures will come into effect in stages starting on April 15th. Canada's 25% counter tariffs on U.S.-made vehicles came into full force first thing this morning. The tariff applies to all vehicles imported over the southern border that aren't CUSMA compliant. In a social media post on X, Prime Minister Mark Carney confirmed that the counter tariffs came into full force at 12:01 a.m. on April 9th. Economist Dr. Moshe Lander unpacked what type of snowball effect the retaliatory tariffs from the EU, China, and Canada will have on the global economy.
Well, Canada's a piddly one in the grand scheme of things. You've got the three big heavyweights now engaging in a fight, and Europe's tariffs are rather small by comparison. $23 billion is not even the amount that Canada is looking to attack the U.S. on. So I think that they're going to come in a measured sort of way. And if the U.S. escalates, then they will escalate in return. But if you have the three biggest economies, and I'm referring to the EU collectively as an economy, if they're all fighting with each other, then all of the small fry that feed off of them and feed into them are going to get caught in this as well. So global growth is probably done for 2025. We could easily talk about a global recession. And of course, like even during good times, we have very little say in what goes on in the global economy. We are the sixth biggest economy, but in the grand scheme of things, we're very small fry compared to the big heavyweights above us. We're not going to have a lot of say what's going on when the markets and the economies are bad either. And this is going to land really badly on Canada then, because there's really not a way out of it. The other thing that we have to watch for too is that as things get nastier, at what point does the US and China turn to Canada and say, and whose side are you on? We haven't had to take a position yet. 6 months ago, it wouldn't have even been a conversation. It would have laughably been the US. But these days, with our hurt feelings and our nationalism that's starting to surface in this country, it's maybe a little bit closer of an argument these days. But what you don't want to do is back Canada into a corner where we have to pick sides, because is that merely going to mean then that the other is going to decide, all right, we're going to tariff you just the same way we're tariffing our enemy, and we really are going to get caught up in something much worse. So Canada has to find a way to do what we normally do, which is be diplomatic, try and be the peacemaker, try not to get too deeply involved in it, and try and bring everybody to the bargaining table that we can make all of this go away.
However, Donald Trump has since announced that he's pausing tariffs on most nations for 90 days, and it's confirmed that Canada and Mexico are included in the pause. And White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said on Tuesday that U.S. President Donald Trump's message is clear. To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen.
In total, since the Liberation Day announcement, nearly 70 countries have already reached out to the president to begin a negotiation. Countries are falling over themselves to reform their unfair trade practices and free open their markets to our country. Why? Because these countries greatly respect President Trump in the sheer power of the American market. These countries realize they've gotten filthy rich over the past few decades by imposing substantial tariffs on American-made products and ridiculous non-monetary barriers to block out American industry. The jig is up. Past American presidents sat by and let this happen, but President Trump stood up for our country, and he is saying no more. The president's message has been simple and consistent from the beginning. To countries around the world, bring us your best offers, and he will listen. Deals will only be made if they benefit American workers and address our nation's crippling trade deficits. America does not need other countries as much as other countries need us, and President Trump knows this. He's going to use the leverage of our markets and our country to the advantage of the people he was sworn in to represent.
And the U.S. president's top trade negotiator came under fire from American senators that have been dismayed by the president's sweeping global tariffs. The U.S. Senate Finance Committee grilled Jamieson Greer about Mr. Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs, creating a market meltdown and increasing the risk of a recession.
I do have a question about, at the end of the day, the other thing in management consulting we like to focus on is this concept of one throat to choke. In other words, when you're finally taking a look at a strategy, someone has to own it. And you can't say that it's the president or the vice president. So my first question to you, in this scenario, the decision maker who decided the alla prima approach, who has obviously had to have spent time anticipating what we saw in the markets and some of the pushback, I'm assuming this all got gamed out because it's a novel approach, it needed to be thought out. Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
Well, Senator, you can certainly always talk to me, but
are you at the tip of the spear?
Well, I'm at the tip of the spear for certainly.
Did you propose the alla prima approach?
So, first of all, I would push back, Senator, just a little bit on this. For now, we've excluded pharmaceuticals and semiconductors to take a different kind of approach.
So let me get
and
to
we've excluded
question.
USMCA.
Section 232 and 301, we know particularly Section 232 is still on aluminum. Section 301 is Chinese imports where there's no other provider. I overheard you say that maybe, or I thought I heard you say in response to another question, that for the near term there won't be any exclusions. Is that true of China, where they have said the U.S. is unilaterally bullying and completely groundless, and they're going to fight to the end? Are the 232 and 301 tariffs exclusions on the shelves until we get to a reasonable agreement with China? I'm just trying to answer a question that I have several people in North Carolina asking.
So the president, again, is the final decision maker on all of these things, and he has directed that there not be exclusions or exemptions.
There will not be any exclusions on steel, aluminum, or any products that are only manufactured in China for the foreseeable future until China determines what the end is, because they said they're going to fight to the end. Again, I'm just trying to communicate questions that I've asked.
Federal leaders for the Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP were all discussing building more homes and making homes more affordable during their campaign stops on Tuesday. Liberal leader Mark Carney told a campaign stop in the Vancouver area that a Liberal government would double the pace of housing construction using prefabricated and modular construction made with Canadian lumber. He called his party's plan, quote, the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War.
Well, the U.S. is trying to keep high-quality, sustainable Canadian lumber out. We will use more of it here in our plan to double the pace of housing construction in this country over the course of the next 10 years. This is the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War. We will build our way out of the housing crisis. We will build our way out of the economic crisis. We will make housing more affordable in Canada once more.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was also in the Lower Mainland, announcing a plan to clamp down on foreign, corporate, and speculative homebuyers.
We're going to make it permanent, the ban on big money investors buying up Canadian homes. That should be a ban. Homes in Canada should be for you and your family, not for rich investors to get richer. In addition, we're going to end the loophole that allows speculators to flip homes year after year. That's got to stop. It just drives up the cost of homes, and it makes it more expensive and impossible for everyday folks to buy a home. The thing is, we're in it for you. So we're going to put forward ideas that make it easier for you and your family to buy a home. We're not interested in billionaires making lots of money off of housing. We're not interested in investors and speculators driving up the cost of homes. We want to put a stop to that so that you and your family can actually afford a home.
And at a campaign stop in Edmonton, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre promised to enlist a task force to crack down on companies that stash money in offshore tax havens.
Right now, Canadians pay more for government in higher taxes. They pay more in taxes than they do for food, clothing, and shelter combined. In fact, the average family is paying $10,000 more tax today than they were before the lost Liberal decade. One, we will be naming a Bring It Home economic and tax task force, whose mandate will be to ensure that we close overseas tax havens and force the very wealthy to pay what they owe. That my task force will specifically propose solutions to close loopholes that allow tax havens to be a source of evading taxes for the well-connected and the global elite. I'll also direct CRA to reapportion the use of its staff. We're going to have fewer auditors going after charities and small businesses and more going after international tax evaders. The goal will be to collect an extra $1 billion from international tax havens and by closing the loopholes that enable them.
And with housing being a main topic of discussion, I sat down with our news director, David Clement, to discuss the housing policies discussed and what the Liberals and Conservatives are bringing to the table. Now, both parties have made housing announcements on cutting the GST on homes and for first-time homebuyers. Mm-hmm. Walk us through just how big of a problem housing in Canada really is.
Yeah, so Canada has been plagued by a chronic undersupply of housing. So the numbers, if we go back to 2016, Canada had about 427 housing units per 1,000 people. In 2020, that number decreased to 426, and in 2022, it decreased to 424 units per 1,000 people. And so the available housing units per person has actually declined over time. And there have been some efforts made to try and ramp that up. We haven't seen that really bear fruit yet. But to put that into comparison to kind of peer countries, Canada has the lowest housing supply per capita in the G7. And so an example would be France. They have 540 units per 1,000 people. So really it comes down to that chronic undersupply, which is driving the cost of homes up. Simple supply and demand, you have increasing demand, limited supply, people bid higher on prices, and you see that kind of floor price increase over time.
And what are some of the key aspects holding Canada back when it comes to housing affordability?
Well, one of them is taxes and fees, and that is both federal, provincial, and local. So depending on the city, the total value of a new home, like the total end price of a new home, can be upwards of 30 to 40% new taxes and fees. So to the city, to the province, to the federal government through GST. And so when 40% of a home is fees and taxes, that leaves a lot of people wondering, why have we created a scenario where the largest cost in the development of a house is government? And so you have both the Liberals and the Conservatives putting forward policies to try and tackle some of the tax aspect that they can at the federal level. Another major issue, which is at the local level, is exclusionary zoning. And so these are rules that essentially limit what you can build on a piece of property. So in a city like Toronto, let's say 60 to 70% of the city is exclusionary zoned, which means you can only have one housing unit on a piece of property. So that means you can't build a fourplex or duplex or a triplex or any type of higher density homes, and that artificially restricts the total number of homes that can be available, because if you can't build more homes on the land within a city, then you have urban sprawl. That's why you see a lot of growth. If we look at Toronto again as an example, outside of Toronto proper, going as far as Milton, Kitchener, etc., is because people are being pushed further and further out of the cities.
And what are housing critics saying about these proposals?
I think the reaction from housing critics has been mostly positive in terms of this tackling the issue of taxation, but there still is the big question of zoning. And that's a local rule. But there have been some conversations about using the federal government either as a carrot or a stick to move cities along in terms of getting rid of exclusionary zoning. So that could be rewarding extra funding to cities to fund infrastructure projects when they get rid of exclusionary zoning, or withdrawing it and saying, if you don't meet this target, then we're not going to give you the money to build more roads and bridges and things like that. And so I would say it's probably mixed right now. Realistically, from the housing critic point of view, it's what are we doing to rapidly increase supply? And the calculation there isn't just taxes, it's a big part, but there's a lot more to that story. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Now, the housing plans that each party has put forward, is it taking into consideration growing immigration, or is this just to deal with the current housing problem and then in 8 or however many years, we're going to go back to the drawing board and do this all again?
Yeah, and that's one of the areas where we won't really know until the campaigns put out if they do, put out their kind of projections on what they think immigration should be. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives have, I guess, hinted or talked about policies to scale things like temporary foreign workers and student visas back. Prime Minister Carney is in favor of the cap that the Trudeau government brought in. Pierre Poilievre has largely been in the same camp, talking about tying housing to immigration, so trying to accommodate for that. But it's very difficult to figure out the specifics of that calculation without having any type of immigration forecast saying we're only going to have X amount of people come in a year, add in whatever the natural birth rate is for everyone who's already here, and this is how many housing units we'll approximately need. This is my plan to get there. So we're still missing that important piece of the equation.
Now, a few critics have said recently that Pierre Poilievre made his housing announcement a few years back, and now Mark Carney's made his. And they're kind of saying that these seem like mere promises. What do you make of those claims that they're extremely similar?
They are. They are very similar, almost identical. I mean, it's an interesting position for the Poilievre team, because whether it be the carbon tax or reversing the capital gains tax or housing policy, it's one of many now where Prime Minister Carney has essentially moved the Liberal Party to the center or towards the Conservatives. So yes, very similar. And I think that's probably largely part of the political climate that we're in, but also the fact that it would appear as of right now that Mark Carney is moving the Liberals to the center. And part of that has been adopting some of what were traditionally conservative positions on housing, on the immigration cap, on the consumer carbon tax. And so, yeah, they are almost identical.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has zeroed the consumer carbon tax and said that the plan moving forward is to ultimately get rid of it. That means that hypothetically, regardless of who wins the next election, the consumer carbon tax may be gone for good. Our next guest, Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, has a book on the subject being published tomorrow, and he joins us now. Franco, thanks for joining with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Now, is the carbon tax fight over, or where do you see it going next?
Well, no, the carbon tax fight is not over. So while Carney set the carbon tax rate to 0, remember, folks, technically the carbon tax law is still on the books. So after the election, the next government could still come back to the House of Commons and crank that carbon tax back up. But more importantly, remember, it's only Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre who is promising to end all carbon taxes. What Mr. Carney is doing is he's not ending all carbon taxes. He wants to change the carbon tax, right? He wants to hammer Canadian businesses with huge hidden carbon taxes, and he hopes you won't notice when they pass those costs onto you through higher prices. So Canadians have been fighting back against the carbon tax for years. You've seen parties back away from the carbon tax, but the fight is not over yet.
And why do Canadians oppose the carbon tax? Is it because of the cost of living?
Oh, that's a big reason, right? The carbon tax makes life more expensive and it doesn't work. You know, for years, you heard the Trudeau government try to spin Canadians, oh, the rebates, oh, the rebates, oh, the rebates. But it's nonsense. The carbon tax makes the necessities of life more expensive, like driving to work, heating your home, and putting food on the table. And it's also the government's independent budget watchdog, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, that shows that the carbon tax was costing the average family up to $399 more than what they're getting back in rebates every year. And like, look, folks, not only are you were paying the carbon tax, but the government was also using tax dollars to hire hundreds of millions of dollars worth of administrative costs. And not only that, but they were charging their GST on top of the carbon tax. So it's just not possible for the government to carbon tax you, then skim hundreds of millions of dollars off the top to pay for more bureaucrats, to then charge its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, and then somehow make everyone better off. Like, Canadians understood that the carbon tax makes life more expensive and doesn't work.
Now, you say the carbon tax is not an environmental solution. Why is that?
Well, that's correct. And that's the reason for two cases, okay? Number one, you can't tax away people's need to drive to work or to heat their home or to put food on the table, right? So what the carbon tax did is it just made people have less money to afford other necessities of life, like saving up for their kids' college or university education, right? And remember, folks, like, making it more expensive to drive to work in Canada or to heat your home in Canada or to buy groceries in Canada, that doesn't reduce emissions in places like China, Russia, India, or the United States. That just hurts Canada. And Canada only makes up 1.4% of global emissions. And the vast majority of countries, about 70%, do not have national carbon taxes.
You also mentioned that politicians were never fully transparent with their carbon taxes. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so look, in the early days when these provincial governments were bringing in carbon taxes, like BC government had the first nationwide or economy-wide carbon tax, sorry, but in the election before that, they never even ran on a carbon tax. Then they promised the carbon tax would be revenue neutral, but it wasn't after a few couple years. BC government promised that the carbon tax would reduce emissions by about 33% by 2020. But look, emissions in BC went up. And it was a similar story in Alberta, where they imposed the provincial carbon tax but never ran on it, and the same story in Ontario. And in fact, you see a similar story with the Trudeau Liberals back in 2015, where you had to squint really hard to see any vague mention of a carbon tax in their platform. In fact, they buried their carbon tax promise about 39 pages deep into the platform. And here's the thing. The Trudeau government was never honest with Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax. And because they were never honest with Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax, they were never able to understand that Canadians couldn't afford carbon taxes, especially those that increase every single year and that don't work to help the environment.
And how impactful was the carbon tax carve in the demise of the carbon tax?
Yeah, the Atlantic Canada carve-out obviously played a significant role, and it did so for a couple reasons. So remember, when the federal government took the carbon tax off of furnace oil for 3 years, what it did was essentially benefit mostly just Atlantic Canadians, because furnace oil is only a popular fuel source in Atlantic Canada, while 97% of Canadians use other forms of energy to heat their home. So what the government did with its Atlantic Canada carve-out was a few things. Number one, it proved that the carbon tax does make life more expensive, right? Otherwise, why would you be providing relief by taking the carbon tax off a fuel source? But number two, it really made the rest of Canada upset, right? Like, why is only one region of Canada essentially getting relief while 97% of Canadian families were out in the cold paying the carbon tax? But number three, what it showed is that the carbon tax was always about politics, not saving the planet.
And do carbon taxes have international support? And what did this mean for Canada's experiment with a federal carbon tax?
Well, they don't. That's the thing, right? 70% of countries do not have a national carbon tax. Meanwhile, Canada only makes up 1.4% of emissions. So all the carbon tax did in Canada was make life more expensive, was punish Canadians for the necessities like driving to work, heating your home, and putting food on the table. And like, Canadians could obviously see that carbon taxes didn't have international buy-in. All they had to do was look south of the border, right? The United States does not have a national carbon tax. In fact, it doesn't matter who occupies the White House. They weren't bringing in carbon taxes. Obama never brought in a carbon tax. Joe Biden never brought in a carbon tax. Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, they didn't run on carbon taxes. And of course, President Trump hasn't brought in a carbon tax and likely never will.
Now, it's no secret you have a strong understanding of the topic, but why did you write the book?
Well, I wrote it for a couple reasons. So number one is you already see these pro-carbon tax activists trying to spin the collapse of the carbon tax, right? You already hear them try to say, well, the carbon tax was a good idea, but Trudeau just bungled the policy or he didn't communicate it well. But nothing could be further from the truth. The carbon tax always was and always will be a bad deal for Canadians for this simple reason. The carbon tax makes life more expensive and it doesn't work. It is not an environmental plan. But the other reason that I wrote this book is because ordinary Canadians deserve it. You know, for years, essentially more than a decade, you had these politicians, these government bureaucrats, these taxpayer-funded academics forcing carbon taxes on the Canadian people, telling ordinary Canadians to sit down, be quiet, and pay your carbon tax bills. But you know what? Ordinary Canadians weren't quiet. Ordinary Canadians kept fighting back, and it's because Canadians pushed back so hard that politicians are backing away from the carbon tax. And these everyday Canadians need to know that their hard work paid off, and that is one of the biggest reasons why I wrote this book Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax.
And what's the most important thing your book will teach those ordinary Canadians who read it?
Well, there's a couple things. There's a lot of good historical nuggets, a lot of good political trivia, a lot of good spicy politics in this book that I don't think you'll see anywhere else. And, you know, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was the biggest, most consistent, loudest critic as an advocacy organization against the carbon tax for years. So you can really see the inside story of how ordinary Canadians push back against this carbon tax. But again, what this book really does is prove that the carbon tax was always a bad idea and that it always will be a bad idea. But not just that, it also looks ahead at where the carbon tax fight is going, right? You already see politicians, environmental groups trying to relabel, repackage, and hide the carbon tax. And it doesn't matter. A carbon tax is a carbon tax is a carbon tax that makes life more expensive and doesn't work.
Now, we do just have about a minute left, but how and where can people buy this book?
Well, head over to Amazon. That's a great place to buy the book, Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. And it really goes through the history of the carbon tax, going back decades. It goes through exactly how the carbon tax costs you big money, right? It costs you on the fuel sources. It costs you like at things when you're going to the grocery store. There's a huge trickle-down effect because of the carbon tax. But also it just shows like, hey, what the government was spinning you on with its carbon tax, it just wasn't the truth. The carbon tax does make your life more expensive, but the carbon tax doesn't work. So, you know, you can pick up this book, Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax, by heading over to a place like Amazon.ca.
Well, thank you so much for the time today, and I look forward to checking out your new book.
Hey, thank you so much.
Liberal leader Mark Carney shot back on Tuesday after former Prime Minister Stephen Harper dismissed his economic skills at a rally for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Mr. Harper introduced Mr. Poilievre at an Edmonton rally on Monday night, where he said that both men running to become Prime Minister once worked for him, but he prefers Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Harper also said that as Prime Minister, he handled the 2008 financial crisis for Canada, but Mark Carney is taking the credit. In response, on Tuesday, Mr. Carney said that while he was working alongside the Harper government as Bank of Canada governor to manage the crisis, Mr. Poilievre wasn't given the same level of responsibility.
Okay, packed a lot in there. Look, Stephen Harper appointed me governor of the Bank of Canada. I worked closely with the late and great Jim Flaherty during the financial crisis. We resolved a number of situations. Many people are familiar with that experience. I note that Pierre Poilievre was not at any of those tables, was not given any of that responsibilities, and note further that in subsequent years he has not gained any responsibility in managing crises or difficult situations. So I'll leave it at that.
Our contributor, Wyatt Sharp, joined us to discuss Mr. Carney's criticism of Pierre Poilievre.
Mark Carney's latest campaign messaging is that Pierre Poilievre has never managed a crisis to the same extent that he has. Of course, he was the Bank of Canada governor during the 2008 recession, also governor of the Bank of England, where he dealt with some really of the biggest financial crises that many G7 countries have faced over the course of the past few decades. Again, the 2008 recession certainly being one of them, where Canada came out better and on top of many of our G7 allies. And so Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, and the rest of his party is really using that as a way to explain why he should be allowed to get elected as Prime Minister over Pierre Poilievre, who, again, as the Liberals are saying, has been a politician as the MP for Carleton since he was 21 years old. Pierre Poilievre is hitting back at that, though. Of course, he has been the Minister of State for Democratic Institutions, where he had to manage various crises around the world with respect to geopolitics and the state of democracy in many kind of underdeveloped countries around the globe as well. And so certainly there's no shortage of back and forth, especially on this issue, but that doesn't mean that, one person isn't more experienced than the other. And both of them still have kind of their arguments as to why they believe they are that candidate, because all things considered, this is the closest kind of most dynamic race that we have seen in a long time, where we have two really strong candidates, both of which are trying to make their respective arguments for why they should be elected, while also having a large portion of excitement and enthusiasm from the Canadian public. Of course, with Pierre Poilievre attracting more than 15,000 people in Edmonton just the other night, 6,000 in Oshawa, and of course, Mark Carney as well, having about 3,000 people at one of his rallies that took place in British Columbia recently. And so it's going back and forth again. As I said, it's the first election in a long time where it seems as if there is this level of enthusiasm like we haven't seen before.
And while the Liberal leader was hitting back at Pierre Poilievre's political career, Mr. Poilievre's criticism of Mark Carney got personal. Mr. Poilievre's past knocks at his main political opponent include criticism that Mr. Carney is no different than his predecessor, Justin Trudeau, and that the Liberal leader co-chaired 2 investment funds that were registered in Bermuda during his time at Brookfield Asset Management. During a news conference on Tuesday, Mr. Poilievre again leveled those criticisms, but also got a little personal.
And make no mistake, it's the same Liberal MPs, same Liberal ministers, same Liberal strategists with the same Liberal policy. And Mark Carney testified against the Northern Gateway pipeline. So let's not, because he has a banker's haircut and he wears a normal pair of navy blue socks, don't think his position on these issues is any different than Trudeau.
There's been a steady increase in the number of asylum seekers at a Canadian border crossing south of Montreal. Canada Border Services Agency data shows that there were over 1,300 applications in March and 557 claims as of Saturday, April 5th. This was at the St. Bernard de la Colle crossing. This comes as the temporary status of hundreds of thousands of migrants in the U.S. is set to expire over the coming weeks and months. Another blast of wintry weather hit parts of Ontario on Tuesday, resulting in multiple collisions during the morning commute and snowfall warnings in some areas. Provincial police urged drivers to slow down after multiple reported collisions across the province, including a 6-vehicle crash. Just over 32,000 Hydro One customers still didn't have power as of Tuesday afternoon, over a week after an ice storm tore through central and eastern parts of the province. Among the hardest hit areas were those surrounding Orillia and Peterborough, with a 78-year-old man dying after a tree fell on him during the storm cleanup. Ontario schools are starting to issue suspensions to some of the thousands of students who aren't fully vaccinated, as the spread of measles continues, giving new urgency to calls for the province to digitize its immunization record system. Toronto Public Health says about 10,000 students are not up to date on their vaccinations, and an initial group of 173 students in grade 11 will be suspended next Tuesday. A total of 574 students were sent suspension orders, which will continue to roll out across Toronto high schools until May. The head of Canada's biggest oil and gas advocacy group says U.S. will always be a major customer for oil and gas from Canada. Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers head Lisa Baton says companies are looking through the recent market upheaval and are focused on the long-term demand outlook. Ms. Baton also says that artificial intelligence data center growth is likely to drive global hunger for energy well into the future. This comes as West Texas intermediate crude prices have lost about $10 U.S. in value over the past week. This is after Donald Trump unleashed a new wave of tariffs. Officials have still not figured out what caused the rupture on the Keystone Pipeline this morning. The volume of crude oil spilled in North Dakota is still unknown, but the company managing the pipeline says it was shut down after control center leak detection systems noticed a pressure drop. A company spokesperson says the spill has been confined in a field and no people or structures were affected. Canadian regulators say that the Keystone Pipeline transported an average of 624,000 barrels of crude oil per day in 2024 from Alberta's oil sands into the United States. The death toll from a roof collapse at a disco in the Dominican Republic has risen to 124. Authorities say that 160 other people were injured when the roof at the one-story Jet Set nightclub collapsed early Tuesday morning. Politicians, athletes, and others were at the club for a concert when it happened. Rescue crews were still pulling out survivors from the rubble on Tuesday, almost 12 hours after the collapse. President Donald Trump welcomed the reigning champion Los Angeles Dodgers to the White House to congratulate them for winning the World Series last season.
That is a very good-looking group of people. And I'm thrilled to welcome to the White House and very special people, actually, very talented people, the 2024 World Series champion, the Los Angeles Dodgers. And I want to congratulate you on a legendary season, and I watched it very closely. Some of those teams were home teams, and you did a big number. You're really amazing how it all came out and how it all ended. Over the course of this amazing season, the members of this team gave us some of the most incredible performances ever seen on the baseball diamond. In all of baseball history, only 6 players have ever hit 40 home runs and stolen 40 bases in a single season. And an elite group known as the 40-40 Club. It's a 40-40 Club, and very few people make it. But unanimous National League MVP, Shohei Ohtani. Looks like a movie star. He's got a good future, I'm telling you. He shattered all of those records last year. Think of it, all of them. And he did something even more because he became the first ever member of the 50-50 Club. So 40-40 is top. Hitting 54 home runs and 59 steals, and accomplished an accomplishment unparalleled in 149 years of Major League Baseball. Think of that. That's just incredible.
The Dodgers all-star shortstop Mookie Betts chose not to visit the White House when he was a member of the Boston Red Sox championship-winning team during Mr. Trump's first term. He was in attendance on Monday, but said that it was not an easy decision, saying last week, quote, "Being black in America in this situation, it's a tough spot to be in." And casting is open for the first ever Canadian version of MTV's hit reality series, Jersey Shore. Paramount Plus says it's looking for 10 fresh-faced, unapologetically wild Canadian singletons to star in the show set to film this summer. The original Jersey Shore premiered in 2009 and followed a group of New Jersey 20-somethings as they fist-pumped, partied, and tanned their way to become reality TV royalty. I'm Teresa Skupik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. Good night, Canada.